Hello, and welcome to New Scientist Weekly, home of the most fascinating science and technology news. I'm Timothy Revel in London.
And I'm Christy Taylor in New York. This week on the podcast, how rogue planets in our galaxy could teach us more about the process that makes stars, plus how your brain anticipates when the beat will drop.
And we'll be looking at a new material for making clothes that is made from potatoes. But first, earlier this month, the World Health Organization declared mpox to be a public health emergency of international concern. For those keeping track, that's just 15 months after the last such declaration ended in May of 2023. But now, a new and seemingly more deadly variant has been spreading in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and beyond. Several neighbouring countries have seen cases, and now Sweden and Thailand have also each reported cases in travellers from the region as well. We initially spoke about this at the end of June, but unfortunately, the problem is so far only getting worse. And scientists fear that even if rich nations are able to address their own risk with vaccines and treatments, a failure to send the same resources to countries where mpox is endemic will only set us up for a cycle of mutations and new outbreaks. Assistant news editor Alexandra Thompson is here to speak about the current outbreak with us. Welcome back, Alex.
Hello.
Could you just talk us through how bad is this current outbreak and how does it compare to that pretty sizable one that we had back in 2022?
Well, the situation is complex because the 2022 outbreak never really ended. It was just deemed to be sufficiently under control for the WHO to call it off being a global emergency in May 2023. And it all gets a bit complicated from there because mpox outbreaks happen frequently in West and Central Africa where the virus is endemic, but normally they're small and contained within households. So in 2022, the infection got international recognition after cases were reported on other continents like Europe and North America for the first time. But in endemic regions, that outbreak has kept rumbling on. And now we're in a situation where there's two outbreaks happening simultaneously with different variants of the virus.
Okay, so that 2022 outbreak is now no longer considered a global health emergency, but the current outbreak is something a bit different. That one is a different variant. So how did that one emerge and when was it first detected?
Well, this new variant was first identified in a small mining town in the east of the DRC last September. So even though mpox is endemic to West and Central Africa, the DRC is often at the epicenter of these outbreaks, and it's where the virus was first identified in humans in 1970. But the new variant seems to affect different people to the one we heard about in 2022. So that one seemed to mainly spread, at least in the West, among men who have sex with men. And now we're hearing reports from Africa of more children being infected with this new variant. And then in terms of how bad the situation is today, well, the numbers tallied so far this year already exceeds 2023's total, which was a record-breaking figure in itself. The DRC alone has had more than 15,000 cases, over 500 deaths, and these are probably underestimates because many infections slip through the nets. And then on top of that, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi and Uganda have reported cases for the first time ever.
Ugh, so you mentioned the new variant is affecting a different group of people, more children and young people. Can we assume that this new strain is more deadly or transmissible? And how closely related are they?
Well, they're both the mpox virus, but the ongoing emergency is due to a version of it called clade-1, which has mutated to become clade-1b, and the virus we heard about in 2022 is a version of clade-2 called clade-2b. So in general, clade-1 is considered more dangerous than clade-2, but whether clade-1b is more dangerous than clade-1 specifically is unknown. And there are signs this may be more transmissible, but we really don't have hard evidence.
I remember when we talked to our reporter Michael LePage about this when the outbreak first started to begin to look really serious. He mentioned that there could be vaccines around that we could already use. So what are the treatment options out there? Are there kind of antivirals and that sort of thing?
Well, mpox is related to the smallpox virus, so even though smallpox has been eradicated globally, its vaccines still come in handy for preventing mpox infections and easing their severity. But we don't know how well those vaccines work against this particular new variant. And then in terms of treatments, it mainly focuses on managing symptoms, so treating a headache or a fever, and then preventing secondary, usually bacterial infections by trying to keep the lesions that blister as clean as you can. There are some antivirals that were developed for smallpox initially, and they have shown some promise against mpox in animal studies, but their effectiveness in people really isn't that clear, particularly for clade 1.
Okay. And then we also looked into this week, Michael LePage again, about whether mpox is likely to become another COVID, a truly global pandemic. Is that something we can answer yet?
We can't rule it out that mpox will be a global outbreak. I think we can say with confidence it almost definitely wouldn't be on the scale of COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And hopefully I won't come to regret that. But for a start, mpox is much less transmissible than respiratory viruses. It's also not a new virus. We've known about it in people for decades, whereas COVID-19 was this entirely new beast. And we already have vaccines, whereas with COVID, we were making them from scratch. Also, the nature of mpox being a DNA virus means it mutates more slowly than SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus behind COVID, and that's an RNA virus. So there are a lot of knowns, but there's also a lot of unknowns. So we don't know the extent to which people have mpox immunity if they were infected in 2022 or other outbreaks, or if they were vaccinated before, or whether people who haven't yet developed symptoms or never developed symptoms can transmit this particular variant. So we're not entirely in the dark. I'd say we're in a dimly lit room.
I do have to say, for a virus that we've known about for decades, it still feels significant that, the original public health emergency ended 15 months ago. We're back at another one now. I mean, how did we get here so quickly again?
Yeah, so just over a year after the WHO declared the last mpox global health emergency is over, it sounded the alarm again. And really, researchers are unanimous that it's down to vaccines not being administered where they were needed most. So in 2022, countries like the UK ramped up vaccine rollouts and they targeted people who are particularly at risk. So the West got a handle on this situation. But mpox didn't just disappear in West and Central Africa. And we know that the more a virus spreads, the more it mutates, the greater the chance that one of those mutations will be meaningful, and then you have a new variant, and that's where we are today.
Got it. So we kind of have the potential for a cycle set up, and with that in mind, what does the international public health community need to do to prevent this from happening yet again in just a couple of years? Is it vaccinations in different places?
Yes, we need to pivot our vaccine efforts to the DRC and other endemic regions, and we need to keep studying this new variant so we can really understand how it spreads, how many people are asymptomatic, and which population groups we should be targeting first for vaccines.
And now, looking away from planet Earth, researchers using the James Webb Space Telescope, or JWST, to look at a star cluster have found new rogue worlds, which are not attached to any star. But these rogue worlds are special. They're not planets, and they're not stars, but they also resemble both. And they're complicating what we thought we knew about how planet-sized objects form. Leah Crane is here. Leah, what's the answer to this riddle?
Well, there's not a simple answer. Basically, there's two main ways to form stuff in space. There's how planets usually form, which is that you have a big disk of dust around a star, and that dust becomes pebbles, and then boulders, and then planets. And then there's the way you form stars, which is, again, a cloud of dust, collapses in on itself, and forms planet-mass objects without any of those extra steps. So brown dwarfs form the second way, but they're not big enough to sustain nuclear fusion, so they fail to become stars. So they're sort of halfway between stars and planets, and these researchers found 6 new ones with JWST.
So why do we think these objects are brown dwarfs and not just, big Jupiters?
Well, they could still be big Jupiters. They're between 5 and 15 times the mass of Jupiter. But their formation environment, plus the fact that one of them seems to have its own disk of dust like a star, and that wouldn't happen if it formed like a planet, means that we think they're probably brown dwarfs and not just big Jupes.
Okay, but we found brown dwarfs before. I feel like you're holding back on us, Leia. Why are these things interesting? Come on, give us the good stuff.
So there's a couple of weird things. The first one is that there's a lot more of these than you would expect if these follow the sort of standard star formation process. These planet mass brown dwarfs make up 10% of the objects in their star cluster, which seems like an incredible amount to me. So it seems like there might be some extra physics going on there that we don't really consider in our models yet, maybe some turbulence. But the other weird thing, which I think is extremely fun, is that the one with the disk is the smallest world with a protoplanetary disk we've ever seen. So it might be forming a sort of mini solar system.
That's
Wow.
adorable.
That is pretty cool.
Like, I'm picturing a mini solar system with many planets and like mini aliens like walking around on them, because
Absolutely.
I'm sure that's how things work. All right, Leia, we haven't talked to you in a while, actually, and I love space and I'm greedy. So you've got another story this week about the hunt for a specific kind of dark matter. Basically, another experiment has failed to find evidence, but maybe in a really helpful way. So step one, Leia, how do you go hunting dark matter?
So first of all, it's important to note that the dark matter we're talking about here is a particle called a WIMP, which is short for weakly interacting massive particle. These particles, if they exist, don't interact with matter very often, so we search for it using basically a big tank of liquid with practically nothing else interacting with it, so that we can detect dark matter interactions if it does come through. In this case, that big tank is an experiment called Lux Zeppelin, and it's full of liquid xenon and buried a mile underground to keep other particles and radiation out. So in theory, when a WIMP slams into one of those xenon particles, we should be able to detect it.
Should, and then in this case, have not.
Exactly. They ran the detector for 280 days. They found no signs of dark matter at all.
But this tells us something interesting, right? It's not just a bummer.
Yeah. It's not just a bummer. When we find nothing, what we're doing is ruling out possible characteristics of dark matter that represent particles we should have found if they did exist. So this experiment was the most sensitive ever, so it ruled out a pretty big swath of characteristics. The constraints it placed are 5 times tighter than the previous best ones, which is pretty good.
Yeah, something I always find quite annoying with dark matter is that it's meant to make up 80% of matter, yet it's so hard to detect. Why is that?
Well, there's 2 parts. The first part is that they would be weakly interacting if WIMPs are real, so they'd pass right through everything, including our detectors largely, which makes them hard to spot. The second thing is that we don't really know what their properties are. We call it dark matter because we can't see it, but other than that, we know very little about it. So it's basically a really long, labor-intensive, expensive game of guess and check. And none of the answers we've checked so far are right.
All right, so very good reasons to not have, had that eureka moment yet. But will there be a point where researchers find they really have to abandon this hypothesis or some portion of it? And then what happens?
Yeah, that point will, unless they find it, that point will happen. Eventually, we'll run out of types of WIMPs that we can reasonably search for. My guess is that won't happen for a few decades, though. And at that point, we have to pivot and look for other forms of dark matter, of which there are many possibilities, although they're maybe a little bit less popular than WIMPs. We know something's out there. It's just a matter of continuing to hunt until we find it.
I just want to live in a world where WIMPs are popular, If you're looking for some research that might hit a little closer to home, maybe take the bewildering lives of teenagers. Take a listen to this week's Culture Lab. Catherine DeLange interviewed adolescent psychologist Lucy Folks about her new book, Coming of Age.
It's an illuminating look at how teens navigate social structures, why risk-taking is such a universal theme for teenagers of every generation, and other ways this age is critical to how we form our identities on the way to adulthood.
And there's advice for parents in there, like when do you intervene and when do you let your child begin to sort out their struggles on their own? That's already in your feed.
For more than 35 years, Gilead has been a leading innovator in the field of HIV, driving advances in treatment, prevention, and cure research. These efforts have transformed the outlook for people affected by HIV worldwide. Jared Baton is a physician, epidemiologist, and head of R&D at Gilead Sciences, who has spent decades working in partnership with collaborators around the world to help overcome the HIV epidemic. Learn more about Gilead's person-centered approach to ending HIV in this new podcast by Gilead Sciences, produced by New Scientist Collab. Visit newscientist.com/podcasts to listen now.
Christy, a slightly random question for you, but do you know the song Insomnia by Faithless?
Wow, the 90s, we're going there. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's about time. I mean, I'm not here to pretend that I'm some sort of expert on dance music, but the thing everyone knows about this song is its drop. So the album version famously is like 8 minutes long, and it starts really subdued, slowly building up and hinting at what's to come. And even if this is the first time you've ever heard this song, and if you're hearing this and you've not heard this song, I suggest going and having a listen. You can feel right from the beginning that something is slowly changing. And then 6 minutes in, it finally comes, this amazing drop. And of course, that's the moment that in the 90s, all the raves went absolutely wild.
I'm picturing all of the 90s raves right now in my head, and it's amazing.
Yeah, so obviously you're also wondering, what am I going on about at this point? What am I building up to? And what I'm building up to is that scientists have now finally figured out how exactly our brains process these musical changes, the drop. So here to discuss it with us is our health reporter, Grace Wade. Hi, Grace.
Hello.
So go on then, talk us through this one. How does the brain perceive changes in music, like when the beat drops?
Well, researchers found that we use two distinct brain networks to anticipate and identify transitions between segments in a music track. These moments where one section of a composition ends and another begins are called musical boundaries. And they are really important for our enjoyment of music, particularly from Western cultures. You know, if you couldn't process musical boundaries, your favorite hit would sound like a monotonous stream of random sounds. It'd be like reading text without punctuation.
Okay, yeah, so that wouldn't be that fun, listening to music that would be that monotonous. You need those changes. So how did researchers identify these brain networks? I'm kind of imagining a silent disco with people wearing skull caps instead of headphones. Is that the research?
Sadly, no, that sounds like a lot more fun, but it's still really interesting. So the researchers analyzed brain activity in 36 adults while they listened to 3 instrumental works from different genres. These included the Argentinian Nuevo Tango composition Adios Nonino by Astor Piazzolla, the U.S. progressive metal piece Stream of Consciousness by Dream Theater, and the Russian ballet classic The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky.
Oh, classics. And very different genres, indeed. And so you're telling me in all of those 3 sort of very different, again, pieces of music, we process transitions the same exact way?
Yep. The team found that right before a musical boundary, a brain network they called the early auditory network activates in anticipation of the musical phrase ending. This network primarily involves auditory areas in the back of the brain's outer region called the cortex. Then a different network activates during and after musical transitions. They dubbed this the boundary transition network. It is characterized by increased activity in auditory areas towards the middle and front of the cortex. The shift in brain activity between these two areas is similar to how we understand differences between sentences in a language. What I found really interesting is that several brain regions actually deactivate during and after musical boundaries. This included a region involved in complex cognitive tasks and decision-making, which suggests that as a new segment begins, the brain redirects resources towards integrating new musical information. We really do become absorbed by music.
It's so neat to hear how our brains are sort of bouncing around to different regions as we're experiencing like this one piece of music. Are there any other interesting bits from this research that stood out to you?
Yeah, so half of the participants were actually semi-professional or professional musicians, and their brain activity differed slightly from that of non-musicians. For instance, they relied on brain areas important for higher-level auditory processing and integration, which probably reflects a more specialized approach towards understanding musical boundaries. Meanwhile, non-musicians showed greater connectivity across broader brain regions, indicating a more generalized approach.
Just imagine Stravinsky going, "Get ready for the beat to drop."
Finally, this week we've got a story about an unlikely material for making clothes. That material is potato scraps. The idea was dreamt up by some students, and it is now a fully fledged business. We've got Madeline Cuff, New Scientist environment reporter, here to tell us more. Maddie, who are these whiz kids and why potatoes of all things?
Very good questions. Hi, guys. So we're talking about a group of students in the UK, university students, and essentially when they were in their final year of a design engineering degree at Imperial College London, they were tasked with dreaming up a sustainable business concept. And the idea they came up with was for a business that makes sustainable textiles from waste plants, potatoes to be more precise.
Yeah, and I imagine fashion is an industry that really needs to become more sustainable. I'm thinking even beyond kind of the fast fashion problem of all these cheap clothes that people seem to buy by the carload.
Yeah, exactly. Like you say, overconsumption is one of the major problems that the fashion industry has got to tackle to become more sustainable. But there's also other big issues like a reliance on fossil fuels to create synthetic fabrics, or the really vast use of land, water and often pesticides that are required to grow cotton.
Got it. So I feel like you still haven't answered my question, which is why potatoes? I'm trying to picture also using potato peels or something to make pants, and I'm just not seeing it.
I'm just trying to build the tension up in here, Well, okay, so to answer the question, it turns out that the stem of potato plants, so this is the bit that grows really tall above ground rather than the bits that are in the soil that we eat, the tubers. So these potato stems have great fibres inside. And once you have pulled out all those fibres and cleaned them off, you can spin them into a material that's just like cotton. And the best bit of this is that currently all of our potato plant stems just go to waste. Potatoes are one of the most abundant crops in the world. They're grown pretty much on every continent. But because the plants themselves are poisonous, all the biomass that's left over after the potatoes are harvested is currently just either pulverised or incinerated by farmers. They can't get rid of it quick enough. So that's essentially the big idea, is to get hold of waste potato plants and use them to spin a yarn that could be used to create a fabric that's just like cotton. So these students now have a company, it's called Fibe, and that's what they're working on.
I mean, this sounds like such a great idea. So I guess that does raise the obvious question, how good an idea is it really? As you say, that cotton famously is environmentally not the best, especially in terms of its water use. How does potato fibre stack up?
Yeah, I don't want to be too down on cotton. It is a great natural material. It's breathable, it's plant-based, it's resilient, but it really depends on how it is grown when we kind of think about its sustainability. It can be really resource intensive to produce, and if it's not grown organically, it can require the use of loads of chemicals. So by contrast, if you're producing fabric from potato plants, that has the potential to use a staggering 99.7% less water, 82% fewer carbon emissions, and no land compared to cotton. Now, that's according to Fibe's own life cycle analysis, and it's essentially assuming that the potatoes are going to be grown anyway, so you don't need any additional land, for example, to make your fabric. They also say that their potato yarn has the same diameter fibres as cotton and a similar strength. So theoretically, it should be able to kind of compete with cotton on quality.
It's quite surprising nobody has thought to do this before.
Right, I know. That's the question I asked as well, but apparently they haven't. It might be that maybe no one has looked closely enough at potato plants to realise they contain great fibres. I mean, as we said, farmers just want to kind of get rid of them once they've got their potatoes. Or then maybe there just hasn't been enough pressure on textile manufacturers so far to find an alternative to cotton. But in any case, Fibe looks like it is the first company to really try and commercialise this idea. They've already secured almost £2 million in investment and grant funding, including from a venture capital firm called Tinshed, which is an arm of the clothing brand Patagonia.
All right, so they have money, they have an idea. Physically, what is this process, though? Is it gather a lot of potato stems and then Rumpelstiltskin them into clothing?
It's a little bit more technical than that. So I had a tour of their lab space earlier this week, which, as you would expect from a new startup, it's a very cool space underneath a railway arch in central London. And I had a bit of a tour through their processes. But in terms of the science, they're being quite tight-lipped. So what we can say is that they take the potato stems, which kind of look like dry twigs when I saw them, and they use a biological process to break down the crop and extract the fibres. So this process, and this is the top secret part, which we don't really have many details on what exactly is going on there, but they will say that this process is biodegradable and non-toxic, which is not like other fibre extraction processes that can rely on really harsh chemicals to get the fibres out of plant matter. So once they've got these fibres, they can put them through machines designed to filter and clean and grade them. And so what you've got left is essentially a kind of tufty ball of fibres that can be spun into a yarn.
Got it. So when can I get my potato t-shirt?
Not quite yet. They've only just, in April this year, unveiled their first potato fibre yarn, which is a blend of 25% potato fibres and the rest being cotton. So it's a cotton potato blend. And having this blend is helpful to keep their costs down and to make sure that the resulting fabric will pass quality control. But they do say that they're working to kind of increase the percentage of potato in their yarn blends. And the plan next year is to start building a pilot production facility somewhere in the UK. So that would mean that potentially the first potato fabric products could come in maybe 2026. The co-founder of Fibe, Aiden, who I spoke to, says the company is about to sign a joint development agreement with a well-known brand, he wouldn't say which one, to develop the product commercially. So there's kind of clear interest from the fashion industry to take this to commercial scale. And the cool thing is that it might not stop at potatoes. I also was shown fibres from pea plants, for example, and essentially Fibe's process could unlock a whole host of new plant-based fabrics.
I'm so curious what this process actually is. But Maddie, the fashion industry does seem like a pretty hard sector to break into. Can, something like potato fabric really be as, I want to say disruptive, but I also want to say sort of impactful, as they hope it will be?
Yeah, I've spoken to a few fashion experts about this. And really, it all comes down to quality and cost. There's still more testing that needs to be done to make sure that these potato fibres kind of really live up to the same standard as something like cotton. They can be a kind of like-for-like replacement for everything from trousers to T-shirts. And also, is it going to be of a similar cost? Because unless it can compete on price with cotton, you're just not going to see the really huge scale orders that would need to happen to make a dent in the industry's environmental footprint. So those are the kind of two big questions that haven't quite been answered yet.
Needs to be cheap as chips.
Yeah, exactly.
That's it for this week. If you like this show and think more people should know about us, please do give us a 5-star rating or even a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
We've got more fascinating stories from New Scientist on our website at newscientist.com, which we spin out of potatoes using a top secret process every single week. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.